If a tree falls in a forest and no one is around to hear it, does it still make a sound? This is much the same question for victims of domestic violence, especially deaf victims. Domestic violence, which has been taking the life of one woman per week on average for the last 12 months, has spurred a national movement. This month, local councillors have spanned the breadth and width of Queensland in what has been seen as the largest display of unity against domestic violence ever seen in Australian history. Yet, in the wake of the horror spate of domestic violence murders, there is one group who are left out of sight and out of mind. With their almost invisible disability, deaf victims of domestic violence remain unaccounted for, rendered with a double disadvantage of deafness and domestic violence. Their story is hushed in their tight-knit communities, and tragically, these victims are usually relying on their abusers for help.
I think the first case where I came across on providing some assistance to a deaf person who was facing domestic violence issues was probably a couple of years ago in Queensland, and she, I suppose, progressively realised that it got to a point where it was time, enough was enough. She decided that that morning that was it. Packed up a car, packed up her children, and she immediately drove to our offices. And immediately we got onto the phone and we rang the Domestic Violence Resource Centre in that area and made an immediate appointment. We also facilitated the booking of an Auslan interpreter to make sure that someone was present to be able to facilitate.
Deaf Services Queensland's Manager for Community Engagement and Development, Lisa Clues, says Deaf Services Queensland, which has been bridging language barriers for 106 years, was never made to deal with domestic violence matters. But over the last few years, the organisation has had to help a lot of victims who are the only ones who can hear them.
Like I say, for a deaf person, it is predominantly just the language barrier that makes them different from the majority of our society. The way you would recognise a hearing person who would be going through a domestic violence issue is the same way that you would recognise a deaf person going through a domestic violence issue as well.
While there is no statistical information available in Australia on the rates of violence against women with disabilities, including domestic violence, there is, however, anecdotal evidence from women with disabilities about the incidence of violence accumulating, and it is now becoming so compelling that it cannot be ignored.
I think the handful of clients that we have dealt with, they are often, their partners are deaf themselves, or sometimes their partners are hearing. Now, when their partners are hearing, I'm going to make a generalisation here, there is a power imbalance. There is a definite power imbalance between within that relationship. And deaf people become vulnerable in those sorts of relationships. But when you've got couples where they're both deaf, then no, it's not their disability. They don't play on the disability, I'm in this situation because of my deafness.
Miss Clues says she has seen up to 10 to 15 clients visit Deaf Services Queensland in the last 12 months.
Predominantly, they will come to us if they do have a domestic violence issue because they just don't know where to go. We will refer them on to the appropriate domestic violence services that are available in our areas. We'll arrange an appointment for them. Sometimes, more often than not, we will attend the appointment with them. We'll also ensure that they have equitable access, and by that I mean they require the services of an Auslan interpreter, which is an Australian Sign Language interpreter. So they are able to share their story and their situation in their own language.
According to Women with Disabilities Victoria, men who use violence often target victims who they perceive are less powerful, such as women who are unable to communicate what has happened to them. Aboriginal disability cultural safety trainer and assessor Jodie Saxon, who is a deaf Indigenous woman herself, says domestic violence experienced by deaf women, especially Indigenous women, is almost never heard of because of their communication circumstances. Some of these experiences felt by deaf women of domestic violence do fit within traditional definitions of domestic violence. However, some do not. It is well known that victims are held back due to financial restraints, children, and sometimes even pets. But for deaf women, they take on complex forms of abuse, specifically related to their disability. Miss Saxton illustrates that it is very difficult to leave a domestic violence situation when your carer is your abuser, and it is not uncommon for a victim to reach out in her deaf community. One of the biggest problems deaf victims of DV are facing is the evident language barrier, yet most relationships are consisting of partners who are both deaf. Guardian and sister of a deaf perpetrator of domestic violence, Sandra Johnston, gives a unique insight into her brother's history of relationships and how his small, deaf community was at the centre of it all.
He had a couple different girlfriends in the past, and most of the case we had a big trouble with the girls when they broke up. First girlfriend he dumped, so there was no domestic violence. But second girl, he hit her, and she actually hospitalized after he hit her. And her family was so upset, so we have to pay some compensation, and so end up in they break up. Since then he had some couple girlfriend, but each time I had, they told me when he got angry, they don't know how to control his anger.
Miss Johnston's brother lives overseas, and although he doesn't add to the Australian statistic, his story paints a very true reality for what it is like for deaf victims and perpetrators in regards to their small communities.
He might find some girlfriend eventually, but it's still in the same community, so they just go out, they meet sometimes. They have very small community, but more active community than us.
Aboriginal disability cultural safety trainer and assessor Jodie Saxton says the silence in deaf communities is damaging, and turning to deaf groups is rarely an avenue for help. It's essential that we include deaf victims into the category of victims of domestic violence, or else the battle local councillors, the Prime Minister and all other groups are fighting to eradicate domestic violence will only be half won. And for every tree that falls in a forest, a deaf woman falls silently too.